Hi, and welcome to our next knowledge sharing session. I'm Pavel, and today we'll talk about Webiny plugins. As you may already know, Webiny consists mostly of plugins, but we never actually explained how we use them and how to approach developing using plugins. So let's dive deeper and take a look at how we use them. There are three main areas where we use plugins. It's React apps, it's API, and it's our Webiny CLI. In React, we use plugins to construct React app templates, to register new menus in our administration app, to register routes in any apps, in admin apps on site, to add views, to add UI elements, etc. So pretty much everything is done using plugins. In API, we use plugins to create handlers, to start our Apollo server. If it's for GraphQL, then we use plugins to register GraphQL schemas and data models using our Komodo data layer. You can also use plugins to simply process an event in a simple Lambda function. It doesn't have to be GraphQL. It's a pretty versatile concept, and you can use it even outside of Webiny. For our CLI, we use plugins to mainly register commands, but you can also use other plugins within those commands, for example, to process post-deploy or pre-deploy hooks. So whenever you feel like you need to expand our CLI, you can simply register a new plugin and add whatever logic you see fit or need for your project. A deploy plugin, which you use when you're deploying your infrastructure, is a good example of such a plugin. It registers a deploy command, and when you run that deploy command internally, it will process before deploy, after deploy, and similar hooks, also via plugins. So let's jump into a code sandbox and see how plugins actually work. Here we are in our first sandbox. The main thing to know about Webiny Plugins package is that it serves as a registry. You import a plugins container class and you instantiate it. By doing that, you get yourself a plugins registry, which has a couple of utility methods like by type, by name, register, and unregister. You can construct your plugins container by giving it a default array of plugins, or you can just use an empty array or not pass any parameters at all, and you will have an empty plugins registry. Then you can use the register method to register any plugins you want. The main requirement for a plugin is for it to have a type property. So this one is the most important. Name property is optional. If you expect your plugin to be used by name, then you will most likely want to specify a meaningful name for your plugin. But if you don't, we will generate a name for you using your type and then add some random unique number at the end of it. So if we look at what the plugins registry looks like now, you'll see that it's an instance of a plugins container, and internally it has a plugins object, and there we have our two plugins that we did register. So one plugin, the one with the name my plugin, was registered during plugins container instantiation. So you can see it here by the name my plugin, and the other plugin was registered later on without the name, and we generated a name for it. Let's see how we use those plugins once they are in our plugins container. So let's take a look at this first example. It uses the by type method, which fetches an array of plugins of certain type. If no plugins are available using that specific type, you will receive an empty array. So you're always safe to do a for each map or anything along those lines. So in this case, we fetch our plugins of type myType, and we expect to get 2 plugins since those are the ones we registered. And we simply loop through them and invoke a do something function which is defined on those plugins. As you can see, we get our first and second output as expected. A cool thing to do with plugins is to define Typescript types for them, and then you're able to pass that type in here. Let's say if we define a type myType, you can use it like this, and if this was a TypeScript file, you would actually have autocomplete on that plugin type. Just something you should keep in mind. It will make your code a lot cleaner and easier to use. Another way to use plugins is by name. In this case, you're always targeting one single plugin by its name. There is no way you can get more than one plugin by name. And if you do register several plugins with the same name, the last one will be the one that will be present in the registry. All the other ones will be overridden. So as you can see here, we fetched a plugin by a specific name called myPlugin, and we got our expected result. So this is the concept on which the whole Webiny is based, and be it React App API or CLI, there is always a plugins container somewhere under the hood, which we just use to fetch plugins and execute them in a way that that fit our business logic. So let's jump over to another sandbox and take a look at how you would use these plugins or plugins container in, for example, an API. Here we are in our API sandbox, and I've prepared a little example of using plugins with an Apollo server. This is a really simplified version of how we use it in Webiny. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated because Webiny uses Apollo Federation, which needs a little bit different approach. But for example purposes, this will be just fine, and it will give you an idea how API works in Webiny. So the idea is to have a pluginable GraphQL schema. And I've created this start server utility, which starts an Apollo server, and it accepts an array of plugins. As you can see, immediately when you invoke it, it creates an instance of a plugins container with the past plugins. And we do a little validation. We require at least one GraphQL schema plugin to be present. And then we just loop over our plugins, which we fetched by type. So GraphQL schema is the expected type. We just fetch those plugins, we iterate over them, and we create an executable schema. So this tool is imported from Apollo server, so we won't go into details about that. But the idea is to use all the available plugins and construct one or many schemas for our server. After that, we use a simple schema stitching to generate one big GraphQL schema. After that, we pass it to Apollo server and we start it. And what we get is a schema which is constructed using 2 plugins. Now let's take a step back and let's comment out this library plugins line. And you'll see how, let me refresh this. You'll see how the moment you disable these plugins, the overall schema has changed. So now our books field is gone. Let's re-enable it. I have to refresh the whole sandbox each time. Oh, sorry, there's a comma missing. Yeah. Come on. There we go. Now the books field is back. So this is kind of the whole concept. We want to be able to simply expand the schema by adding plugins. We don't want to go into the code and change the actual schema, because that will require us to have it all hard-coded and modify one huge file with your whole GraphQL schema. This way, we use plugins. Let's say we comment out the hello plugins. Now we will only have the books in our schema. See how flexible this is. Let's undo that. Refresh. There we go. Now we can simply run a query and we get our data. Now let's take a look at how these resolvers are implemented. So I've created this plugins folder, and in there you will find one plugin factory for hello plugins. And it registers a simple, it doesn't register, it creates a simple plugin of type GraphQL schema, which defines type defs and resolvers. Now this is regular schema definition. There's no magic here. And we have our hello resolver. Now, why we like to use plugin factories is because you can configure them. You can actually configure how your plugins work. So let's say we don't want this result to be hello. We can actually change the greeting right here and say we want the response to be hey there. Okay, I'll save this. And I messed up something. Oh, no, it's okay. It was rebooting. So yeah, now the message is hey there. So this is a very simple example, but you get the idea. You can configure your plugins to behave in a certain way, and it can be a lot more complex than just changing a string. Our library plugins factory doesn't take any parameters, but we still like to define it as a factory because down the line you never know when something needs to be upgraded or changed, and you would maybe like to add configuration options for this plugin. So we like to keep our plugins as factories. Again, we have a GraphQL schema plugin, and in our resolver we simply hard-coded an array of data, and that's what we get here. So it's a simple concept, but it's very flexible, and it really allows you to do all kinds of crazy things. And even you could even publish these plugins to npm and simply install them as dependencies and import them here. So you can share your plugins, you can share the whole apps, you can share GraphQL schemas, anything. It's up to you how you split your code, but this is a very flexible approach. This is somewhat like what we do with our Apollo Federation, except there it's a little bit more complex, but the idea is still there. So another thing to note is that we can actually access our plugins container within the resolvers. When we construct our Apollo server has this function called context, and it is executed each time when Apollo server is processing a request before going into your resolvers. So this allows us to attach our plugins container to the context on every request. And now if we go to, let's say, library, and let's console log our context plugins, and you'll find that, give it a second. Yeah, I'll just minimize this. Let's do a query, and you can see that we have our plugins container with all our plugins. So what this allows us to do is, this allows us to process any data or any logic using other plugins. So this way your whole system is connected using context, and your plugins are accessible from anywhere within resolvers. Pretty neat. Okay, now let's jump over to a React sandbox and see how we use plugins in React apps. Here we are in our React sandbox, and we will use a very simple React app to demonstrate how you can use Webiny plugins in React. So here things are a little bit different. Since React doesn't have a global context, we export an instance of a plugins container using the named export called plugins, and it represents a single instance of plugins container for you to use. This is useful, for example, in browser, where everything is kind of global, but at the same time, you need to somehow reference a central registry of your plugins. Now, this package was created long before a proper React context was introduced. So now you could probably use it using one plugins provider and passing it an instance of a plugins container, and then just use hooks to use the context and access those plugins. But this works just fine, and so far we don't really see a need to change this into React context. So just keep in mind that this plugins here is already an instance of plugins container. Okay, so what's going on here? So we have our React app, and we are registering some plugins. And let's take a look at what the app component does. So the app component just grabs plugins. Again, it's imported at the top, so it's always accessing the same instance of plugins. And we grab plugins by type widget, and then we iterate over them and we call a render function. Now this may look a bit weird, but we do need to clone the resulting element so React doesn't complain about not having unique keys. So this is, if you want to use plugins to render components, it's how we do it most of the time in Webiny apps. This is the way. You have to call render. Let's say this is returning some React element. You have to clone it and pass it a key with plugin name. We usually use plugin name as it is always unique. Okay, so what happens is you can see this widget 1 being rendered. Let's take a look at our plugins. So the plugins that are registered come from this dashboard file. It's again a plugin factory, but this time it's returning an array of plugins, which also works fine. Our plugins container is smart enough to handle both single plugin objects and arrays, and even arrays of nested arrays, so don't worry about the structure of your plugins. We have only one plugin available here, and you already know how this works. This is really simple stuff. Now let's uncomment this second plugin, which is really interesting. I'm missing a comma here. Let's do that. And then it says plugins not defined because I forgot to uncomment the import at the top. And there we go. Now we have 2 widget plugins. And here comes the interesting part. Our plugins can use other plugins to render more stuff. And then those other plugins can internally use other plugins to render their stuff. So This is the approach we used to build the whole Webiny and all of the Webiny apps. So let's go through the code line by line and take a look at what's going on here. So we have our two widget plugins, but one of the plugins, the second one, wants to render some, let's say, metrics. Just as an example. We will expect for widget metrics plugins to exist, so we grab them, check if they actually exist. If they do exist, then we will render the name of our current widget plugin. You see it's assigned to the content at the top. And then we'll just render a list of metrics by following pretty much the same approach. So we iterate over plugins and we render them using some method. As you can see, names of functions, parameters, it's completely up to you. You control how you construct your plugins and the whole interface between plugins. So right now nothing is being rendered because we don't have any widget metrics plugins registered. So let's take a step back, go back to index and uncomment this plugins register, but first let's uncomment the import itself. And then we'll register them. And all of a sudden we have two metrics rendered. We have a temperature and humidity. And each one of those is a plugin of its own. So widget metrics has a function render metrics and it renders something. Then we have another widget metrics plugin which renders humidity. Now let's say we want to add another plugin and we'll just render, let's say speed, miles per hour. But bam, and you get another metric rendered. So this is the approach, and this is how you can render nested components and nest plugins. And this is how the whole Webiny is built. The page builder, the CMS, the form builder, absolutely everything in Webiny is built using this approach. There is one top level component which takes plugins and starts processing layout components. Then some of those layout components fetch other plugins and render navigation. Then other plugins render user menu. Then other plugins render routes and views. Then those views grab other plugins to render forms and so on. So once you know how this works, it becomes really easy to create your own apps and create your own puzzles. It's all like one giant Lego. So yeah, I think we will stop here and let's take a look at CLI plugins as our last area where we use plugins. And then you are ready to start digging through our repository and read through packages, as they are all built using this approach. For this, I jumped over my IDE where I have Webiny.js repo set up, and we will take a look at the code in here. Open webiny.root.js file and you will see a bunch of require statements which import different plugins for deploy, plugins for scaffolding, hooks for deploy process, etc. And let's add a new plugin which will register a hello command. So the way it works is you just define a new plugin inside of this plugins array. And for CLI command, obviously it's type CLI command, and it has this create function which accepts an instance of yargs. We use yargs for our CLI, and here you just follow the yargs API. So define a command hello with description, salute the user, and we don't have any positional or optional arguments, and we just execute our callback which says hey there, hope you're enjoying our knowledge sharing sessions. And now let's just run yarn Webiny help, and you will see our new command is here. It's hello, salute the user. And this is it. This is how you add a new command using a CLI plugin. Now let's actually execute the hello command. And there we go. And so we've reached the end of our knowledge sharing session. I hope you enjoyed it and I managed to clarify some things about plugins, how they work and how we use them. If you still have questions, please do reach out on Twitter, on our community Slack. You can find the link to our Slack on our website. And yeah, until next time, cheers.